I'm going to wander a little bit. I've talked about storytelling a couple hundred times on stages, and I really needed a chance to try something new. So it's brand new, so stick with me. But I think you're really going to enjoy it because I'm fascinated myself by the idea of unsafe thinking, which is really about wandering. So let's jump in. This guy here is John Speke. And I wish he was with us today, not just because he looks like one of those guys from the MasterCard commercial and probably would fit right in, but because he was a master wanderer. This guy was one of those Victorian gentlemen who the unknown was a kind of personal affront to his manhood. If something was not known, he was going to figure it out, right? And in his time, the most important unknown was the source of the Nile. This is a question that had been thought about for millennia. The ancient Egyptians relied on the floodwaters of the Nile. It was sacred to them. And they wondered, where does this come from? But they could never find it. Because if you start heading up the Nile, which is heading south, you head up the Nile, and there are crocodiles, and there's angry hippopotamuses, and there's angry tribespeople who will probably kill you along the way. But if you get past all that, you get to the Suud. And the Suud is a 57,000 square kilometer swamp where the water flows in every direction, where reeds are as tall as a man. When the boat goes in, before long, you have no idea what direction you're going. You have no idea how to get back, and no one could get through the Suud. So Speke has this idea. He's going to skip the Suud. He's going to go south of there, and he's going to walk from Zanzibar, which is out on the right here, or your left, and he's going to find a way, but just skipping the Suud, to just walk to the source of the Nile. And so he tries this, right? He walks for 1,000 miles across uncharted territory. Along the way, all of his pack animals die. His guides abandoned him. He meets with many near-death experiences, but the worst is that a beetle crawls up his nose, and he has to pull it out with a knife, damaging his brain in the process. He makes it to the shores of Lake Victoria, and he sees that he is first European ever to see Lake Victoria, and he sees that this is where the Nile flows, and he takes a deep breath, and he declares, "I have found the source of the Nile." Now, there's an obvious problem with this claim. I'll get to that in a minute, but you can't blame the guy for wanting to just, stop, right? He walked 1,000 miles across unknown territory, and he becomes this international hero. There's still an obelisk in Kensington Garden for Speke, but there is a problem, and it's a really wonderful problem, which is that a lake of this size doesn't just sort of spring up out of nowhere. A lake of this size has a source too. Speke got really far, but he didn't really solve this problem. There was something wrong with it. Now, you would think with GPS and WikiLeaks and whatnot, like we would just be able to know the source of the Nile. But actually, you can't see it from space. And you can't sense it with any of the amazing technology we have. You cannot plug it into Waze. You have to find it yourself by foot. And so the source of the Nile remained unknown till 2005, when this guy, Cam McClay, decided that he and a few friends were going to start at the mouth, and they were going to drive these inflatable boats all the way up the Nile from its mouth to its true source. Just these little boats, inflatable, little outboard motor. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about their story in a moment, but I want to tell you why I'm telling you this. I tracked down Cam McClay because I started writing a book about creativity. I was calling it Unsafe Thinking because I was wondering how some people manage to depart from what they know, from what comes easily, from those patterns that have sort of gotten them to a certain place in their lives. And then the world changes around them, and they decide to leave the beaten path. They decide to wander, which is what's so wonderful about this theme for me. They decide to wander off the path, but why do some people do it well when our brains are programmed to sort of stick with what we know? So I started making phone calls and finding people like Cam McClay, who had found the true source of the Nile. So what happened here? They start going, and things are going okay. The Nile's pretty slow, and unlike Speke, they've got outboard motors. They've got some good technology, and they go and everything's fine, but then they reach the Suud on day 40. Now, this is the Suud. This is sort of the last known civilization before you head in. They head into the Suud, and before a few miles go by, their GPS cuts out. Their distress beacons don't work. They are literally off the map. Now you can imagine there are reeds above their heads, and there's channels going in every direction. At first they think, okay, we're just going to follow some of these channels. But the channels often lead after miles to dead ends. There are no gas stations, obviously, in the Sud. There are no people in the Sud. And they have no idea where they're going to go. They are hyper aware. They're afraid. But these are explorers. They're curious, too, about the situation. And Cam sees some water hyacinths floating by. These are invasive species that have no roots. And before long, he sees that the water hyacinths themselves are a map of the flow of the river that actually makes its way through the Sud. So little by little, they follow the water hyacinths. They make it out the other side. They are the first people now to successfully navigate from the mouth of the Amazon to the other side of the Sud. But of course, they're not even close to done. Next, they get to the Murchison Falls. These are 50-meter falls with cliffs on either side. And even approaching these falls would be completely impossible, let alone trying to go up them somehow. Now, of course, they could have gotten helicopters, but these guys were going to do a river trip, the longest river trip in history, to the source of the Nile. So what do? Caroline, you'll appreciate this. They took a glider wing. They attach it to one of the boats. They go at the falls as quickly as they can, and just before they hit, the glider actually lifts the boat up. They come up above, and then they're about to land above the falls into a pool of hippopotamuses, any of which, if you wake them up, can kill you. They touch down, and now they're over the falls. They go back and forth to bring all the boats and stuff up. And I'm telling you this story because it is freaking amazing how much creativity it took to get up to the top of the Nile. They took 6,000 kilometers to make it. They got to Rwanda, where there's just a trickle of water coming out among some rocks. And they take the record for the longest river trip in history. They also find what National Geographic says is likely the source of the Nile, but nobody really cares anymore because the age of exploration is long over. There is no obelisk to Cam Maclay anywhere in London. But I realized in these conversations with people like Cam that creativity is not just about writing or painting or poetry. It's not just the artists working in their studio. Creativity is really about taking on a challenge for which there is no map. It's about wandering. It's about being able to be flexible enough to think and act in new ways and to get to your destination. And we need to learn how to do that. So I set out looking for a lot more people like Cam. And my job with this book right now, I'm in that weird zone of like no idea how I'm going to finish it or where it's going to go. I've sold it, so it's going to happen, but I'm not sure what I'm doing next. But I'm talking to people, and I'm listening to what they have to say, and then I'm diving into the science to figure out if they know what the hell they're talking about. And usually they profoundly do. So I'm going to tell you a few of their stories and some of the lessons that I've taken from them that I think will help you all be excellent wanderers and be effective in reaching whatever that creative goal you have, wherever you want to wander that no one's been before. So first, this is Micah White. Micah is a really interesting guy. He is the guy who started Occupy Wall Street, which became a global movement. He worked for Adbusters. And all of his life, he's been a sort of protester. He's been fighting against the police. He's been, tracked by the CIA. He's been in multiple war zones. And he's always coming up with these new ideas for how to do protest movements. Now, Occupy was his greatest success and also, as he says himself, his most spectacular failure. But he's putting himself in harm's way, and he has this one theory, which is a very unsafe wanderer's theory, which is that the police know what's coming if you ever use the same tactic twice. To be effective, whatever worked last time, you may not do again. And yet you have to face down guns. You have to face down the NSA, the CIA, with an idea you've never tested before. And so I asked him, doesn't that cause a lot of anxiety? Because I always have a lot of anxiety when I'm doing anything, and I'm mostly pressing keys on a keyboard. There's no guns involved. And his response was, I feel anxiety all the time. And before I tell you what he told me to do about it, let me tell you a little bit of the science that I looked into after he told me that. So basically, when we set out into the unknown, we immediately, or when the environment changes around us, whether we want it to or not, we immediately sense a sort of threat awareness, right? We're no longer in our comfort zones. And when we sense threat awareness, our brains automatically change. Something called cortical arousal happens in our brains. And what this means is that we're flooded with a kind of chemical that's there to protect us, that's there to get us to run away or to fight, right? And these chemicals are specifically designed, they pull the blood out of our stomachs, they shut down any unnecessary functions in our body. And what they often shut down is our ability to see new possibilities, right? You don't need to dream about 50 ideas when you're being chased by a tiger, right? You just need to run. So that's good. It's evolutionarily advantaged to have this cortical arousal. And a certain amount of cortical arousal is good. Without it, you wouldn't get out of bed. Interestingly, Thomas Edison, who was a great inventor, of course, he knew that creativity happened in low cortical arousal states. He would sit down for a nap in a chair with 2 metal balls in his hands, and as soon as he would fall asleep, the balls would crash and wake him up. It was those moments of incredibly low arousal, though, that he came up with some of his greatest inventions. But that's a side note. So anyway, causing a little cortical arousal in myself now that I'm losing my track. So what happens in cortical arousal is it leads you to anxiety, which leads you to stereotypical thinking, right? Okay, what do? We got to get this done. There's a deadline coming. We've never seen this before. We got to act now, right? Stereotypical thinking. Well, what does stereotypical thinking do when you're in a new situation? It kind of screws you, right? So you get more threat awareness. And you get locked into this safe thinking cycle. You just keep trying the same damn thing that you tried before. And you know, like next time, when we have more time, we'll change. But not right now, it's too urgent. So what do you do about that? Well, this is where Micah's advice really came in handy for me. He said to me, I feel anxiety all the time. But now I know that when I feel anxiety, it's a sign that something good is about to happen. It's a sign that creative breakthrough is near, because I've never had creative breakthrough without first feeling anxious. And I won't go into all the science behind that, but that correlates very well with a lot of the brain science, that you cannot avoid feeling cortical arousal and anxiety. It's impossible. If you try to interrupt that cycle, it only gets worse. But if when you feel it, you're mindful of it, and you recognize, this is a sign that I'm in the unknown. This is a sign that I have wandered somewhere that matters to me, because if it doesn't matter to you, you're not going to be that nervous. This is a chance to get the energy to think differently. So the first lesson that I've learned so far is that you can be a great wanderer if you greet anxiety as a good sign. I'm not saying it's easy. Anxiety sucks. But it really is a sign that change is coming. So that's my first lesson for you. Okay, this is Teresa Amabile. She's a researcher at Harvard, and she's one of the world's foremost experts on creativity. And her research was really kind of confusing me in some ways. I'll explain in a moment. So I gave her a call to hear her story and get some questions answered. So her story is fascinating because she was a woman working in the 1970s in creativity research, one of the only. And there was all kinds of orthodoxy about what you study and what you don't. And Teresa wanted to study children and creativity, which got laughed off and thrown away. But she had this idea for her doctoral thesis, which was that she would bring some children together to art parties. And she had no money, so her sister had to kind of be her research assistant. And she wanted to see what would motivate these kids to make better art. So she brought these kids together, and she took half the kids and told them, if you make good art, you're going to get a prize. And she took the other half of the kids and said, if you make good art, you'll be entered in a raffle, and one of you might win a prize. So one would be judged, and the others wouldn't. But the harder you worked in the prize group, the judging group, the more you would get rewarded. So she did these, and she took all that art, and she showed it to these art critics who didn't know what the experiment was about. And she found again and again that the more that you rewarded somebody for creating art, the worse their art became, the less creative it was. And this was fascinating. But now it's kind of well known that what's called intrinsic motivation leads to creativity. But I've always been troubled by something in there, which is sort of why is that, right? Like, what's wrong with a little bit of, a little bit of carrot to go along with your creativity to pull you towards something that you care about? And when I asked her about that, she told me something that I think is really fascinating and resonant with probably all of us today, which is that creative work happens when the experience of trying to do something new happens on a spectrum from doing something for love and doing something from deep distraction. And the problem was, there's nothing wrong with rewards, but the problem was that rewards were distracting. Thinking about what you were going to win when you made your art got the kids' brains to be pulled away from what they were doing. And so I got kind of obsessed with this distraction thing, because besides feeling anxiety, I'm almost always distracted as well. And so I started looking more into that. And I found the work of this guy named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who is one of the also foremost researchers on creativity. And he also was looking at this problem. And he said, he studied the sort of best performing artists, athletes, CEOs, and he has this idea called flow theory, which some of you may have heard of. And flow theory says that when you get into a certain zone, a sort of flowering of love, creativity, excitement, and focus appears all around you. And it sounds a little squishy, I know, but flow theory is one of the most validated psychological phenomena of creativity in the entire field. And he writes about it and talks about it, and he says it's achievable for everybody. Because if we can manage to balance challenge and skill, if we're getting to an activity that we care about, right, and the challenge level is too high for our skill level, we start to feel a sense of fear. We can't really do it, right? But if our skill level is too high for the challenge, we start feeling boredom. But in between these two poles is something called flow channel. If you can get on the right part of this graph, which sounds really simple, you can start to experience that sort of love, right? So what does this have to do with distraction and love, right? Well, fear and boredom are not good feelings. And when we're in those feelings of fear and boredom, we look for a kind of solve. We look for a solace, right? And in today's world, your iPhone stands ready at all times to get you out of fear or boredom and to bring you to a near state. So we reach for distraction when we feel afraid. We reach for distraction when we feel bored. In fact, a lot of the designers who create our phones are actually creating flow experiences. They're specifically using flow theory to give you a little 3-minute game that you can play that's right in level of your skill and challenge, right? But if we allow ourselves to take that distraction, we cannot get into or stay in flow. And so I know we all have this experience of working on something that we care about, that pushes us to our limit, and that we want to reach for some way out of that feeling. But when you are, the trick is to avoid reaching for distraction and pull yourself to rebalance that level of challenge and that level of skill. If you can do that, if you can just tone down that challenge a little bit, or if you can figure out how to bone up those skills a little bit in that kind of balance, it has been studied and shown that you can stay in that state of love. And so it's very easy. The way Csikszentmihalyi has worked this theory has been to create a little buzz. He used pagers in the 70s and 80s to ask people, are you feeling flow right now, and why? And I have found for myself that asking that question, instead of just reaching for Twitter, New York Times on my phone, or a game, if I ask myself, am I in flow, and then I tune up my skill or challenge, or I rebalance my skill and challenge, I can find that source to stay out of my comfort zone and into a state of deep love for the work I'm doing. So if you are trying to wander, I recommend that you really take notice of those moments you want to run away, and that you give yourself a tool, which is to ask yourself, is this too hard for my level of skill or too easy, and can I rebalance? Because science shows that this is the best way to stay creative. Okay, one more story for you. Let's see how I'm doing on time here. Just going to check my phone if that's all right. No, I got plenty of time. Whoops. And you should do it twice. All right. So this is a little bit of an old story, but I think a really interesting one. This guy is Barry Marshall. He's a scientist, a researcher, and a doctor, really a doctor, who grew up in Western Australia, in a mining town in Western Australia. And he was working as a junior doctor in a health clinic. And all of these patients were coming in with peptic ulcers. And we had known for quite a long time that peptic ulcers are caused by two things. Stress, right? If anyone says, oh, you're giving me an ulcer, right? It's because you're stressing them out. And smoking. And the reason that we knew this was that a lot of 40, 50-year-old men in New York City were being studied who had peptic ulcers. They were stockbrokers. They were really stressed out, and they smoked a ton. This is in the 1950s. So obviously, stress and smoking caused peptic ulcers. And this was a deep orthodoxy in the medical community. But Marshall had, and the guy he was working with, had patient after patient coming in with peptic ulcers, which is a real problem, by the way. If you have peptic ulcers, you have to take antacids your whole life. It's a multi-billion-dollar global business, and it can eventually kill you as well. So he had all these people suffering, and he found that they all had something in common, which was they all had this bacteria growing in their gut, a certain kind of bacteria. And he began to theorize that if you kill this bacteria, you might be able to solve their ulcers. And he could not get anyone to believe him. He started just illegally sort of prescribing heavy doses of antibiotics, and he started curing people. But he was in a backwater, and no one would listen to him. He applied again and again to the Lancet to show his research. No one listened. So one day, he took some beef broth. He took a scraping from one of his very ill patients, and he drank a couple billion copies of this bacteria without telling his wife. And he got really sick. He said he had water coming out of both ends of him for quite some time. He smelled like death. And his wife eventually asked him, what's going on? And he was trying to pass it off as just a, common cold or something. And he told her. And she was terrified. She thought everyone in the family might die. She said, you have to go get antibiotics right now. And he said, just give me 2 more days. And she did. So he, 2 days later, went in. His gut was full of these things, and he had given himself a pre-ulcer condition. He took the antibiotics, cured himself. Now, this was a story. And the National Enquirer, which is maybe a tabloid magazine that prints gossip and weird things that happen in the world, printed a guinea pig doctor story about him, the man who experiments on himself. And he eventually, through that, got picked up by the New York Times, and 20 years later won a Nobel Prize for this discovery. And he has helped millions of people because he was willing to drink that glass of beef broth. So the last lesson is not drink beef broth full of bacteria, actually. That's an interesting part of the story. It's not the main part of the story. It's not even Barry that I'm interested in. It's the medical community. The people who were so stuck in an assumption, the experts who were so wrong and couldn't see another way because they were so stuck in a way of thinking. And so I started looking into expertise. And I met this researcher at Berkeley who did this amazing study on experts, actually. Over 20 years, he followed 284 experts, and he asked them about predictions of the future. And he got 82,361 predictions about the future. And then he saw whether they came true or not. Now, these experts were not great at predicting the future. In fact, if he had blindfolded monkeys and had them throw darts at a board, they would have done better. But to be fair, there was one class of expert who did have a different level of performance. These were the experts who were often on TV. These are the experts who had high degrees and large prizes. And these experts were markedly even worse than those dart-throwing monkey experts. And so this was amazing to him. He wanted to understand how could this possibly be. And a lot of research now has gone into it. And what it boils down to this is you've all had this experience, when you're wandering, when you're new to something, or when you're doing that exercise Tara did for us, your eyes are closed. You know you're a beginner. You have no ego, right? You're wandering in a new city. You're curious. You're alert. Your mind is learning new things. This is a state of creativity. But the minute you take a position's a military term, right? What do you do with positions? You defend them, right? So the minute you start defending a position, the minute all kinds of cognitive biases come into your mind, the minute all kinds of negative emotions about people who don't agree with it, the minute you do that, you stop becoming someone who's learning and growing, and you start becoming someone who has a fixed idea of how the world should be. And it's unavoidable. The minute that you form an opinion and start thinking of yourself as an expert is the minute that you stop effectively wandering. So this is really difficult because the world wants to be and rewards us for being experts. But my third lesson is you'll be a better wanderer if you strive to be an explorer and not an expert. And I know that I'm like standing up on the podium here like an expert, but I am not. These are just some new ideas that I'm working with and playing with in trying to write this book. So yeah, to sum up, the 3 lessons that I have learned so far, and I hope before the book is done that I'll have 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 for you, are these. Strive to be an explorer, not an expert. Resist distraction with love, and greet anxiety as a good sign. And now that I've shared these beginning thoughts, I do have a request for you. This is my Twitter handle and a place you can reach me. I am desperate to meet the unsafe thinkers of the world, and not just the people that everyone's heard of, but the small stories, the people that you would never expect to be in a book like this. I'm looking for the creative breakthroughs, and not just like the crazy rebels, but the people who have challenged themselves, who have changed themselves, who have tried out new ways of thinking and challenged the world in that way. And if you guys know any, please let me know them, because it will deeply make me a better thinker myself. So thank you so much.